Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Tammy, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. This is my second program of the day, and I've been kicked from pillar to post on both of them. From your end, what's the process going to look like? Is there anything that we need to do? Actually, first of all, let me do this so it's not apparent that I'm looking at you on the side. So we're just waiting right now for Chloe.
Yeah. I didn't know if there's anybody else that needs to be let in early.
Melissa is supposed to be coming.
Okay.
But other than that, I don't know of anybody else.
Okay.
So.
I think here comes Melissa. Yeah.
There's Melissa. Now, Melissa, if Chloe's not here, you're going to have to do the presentation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Racial trauma, bad. We're done.
Oh, here's Chloe.
I cannot work out lighting on this thing. Hi, Chloe.
Oh, hi. I was on mute.
Hi.
Hello.
Chloe, I'm going to introduce you around. Tammy Back is our representative from William and Mary from the SWEM library, and she's going to be our technical coordinator today. Is that
Yeah,
right?
we can call it that.
And Melissa Simpson is the head of the Adult Services Division where I work at Williamsburg Regional Library. So she's my boss. Make me look good.
Nice to meet you all. And I'm Chloe Edwards with Voices for Virginia's Children. I lead our Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia campaign.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to talk about a little bit in the introduction. I'm going to mention it. So if you want to say more about what the Voices for Virginia kids are, please do so. Now, you're going to be asking questions and taking answers via chat. Do you want us to interrupt you at any point, if you see something coming in on chat or?
Yeah, with the share screen, it can be hard to, and I have my presentation here, so I'll need that access, but it can be hard to see the chat. So if you want to interrupt me, you're more than welcome to.
Okay.
I wasn't quite sure how long the presentation is without a break, but I have incorporated a break. It's usually about an hour and 45 with some Q&A, 15 minutes for Q&A. But I'm gonna ask them midway if they'd like a break or if they need a break. So I have a slide for that to kind of get a feel of the room.
Okay.
So, Andrew, when you're doing your introduction, you'll tell people to turn off their video and microphone, and then ask people to use the chat if they have questions or comments.
Tammy, they're not going to be able to access.
So everybody coming in is going to have their mics automatically muted. I mean, I do think they'll have video though, so they can keep their video on if you want them to. What we typically tell people is, you know, keep their mic muted. They're already muted, but to keep it muted, and then to use speaker view if they'd like, because that will just show Chloe when she's talking instead of showing, like, we've got over 100 people signed up for this, so
Wow, good.
little windows. If they put it on speaker view, they can just see the person who's speaking. So that's normally what I say. And yeah, if they have a question, you know, we ask them to put it in the chat, and then you can get to it later. Talk.
Yeah, and of course, Chloe's going to be doing her her PowerPoint slideshow, so share screen is going to kind of render that.
Yeah, let me make sure I have that on actually.
You can
Chloe,
see people though, even when you're doing a shared screen, if you don't have it on speaker view. So I think I would tell people to keep their video off.
Yeah,
Not everybody will be able to figure out how to not have it on, but I would say turn your video off and don't unmute yourself. We're going to be talking through chat.
Yeah, we could do that.
Like people.
And Tammy, can you make me a co-host too, so that I can?
Yeah. Yes, I can do that right now.
I'm sorry, Chloe, you started to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, I do like seeing people's faces. I usually have the chat box a little open just so I can kind of connect with the energy if there is energy.
Okay. So you would like to see people?
Yeah, but I do invite them to turn their screen off just because some people feel more comfortable with the presentation or can get emotional. But for the folks that do leave their screen on, I kind of like seeing facial expressions and stuff.
Okay.
Chloe, do you want to try sharing your screen just so we can make sure it's working before we start the program? You should be able to. There you go. Great. Yep.
Is that on the right view? It's on presenter view.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to run and get some water. Excuse me.
Oh, yeah. Yep. We got some time. So.
Well, Tammy, this is interesting. Somehow I have hit myself to hide my self view. So I'm looking for my view options here. Okay, here we go. Never mind. I thought I was going to have to ask you.
So, Andrew, if we're going to ask people to leave their video on, then you do want to tell them about the single speaker view to be able to get rid of everybody else's image.
And that is?
Go through periodically to make sure that we're not getting anybody doing something they shouldn't be doing in their background.
Okay.
Yeah, I also, we can mute people and we can mute their video. So if I see somebody who's doing something inappropriate, I can manually, you know, mute their video down. Or if someone starts talking in the middle of it because they don't realize they accidentally unmuted themselves, like can go and unmute them. I mean, mute them.
Are we going to start with everybody muted and
yeah,
with cameras on? Okay.
Yeah, all the people coming in, except for the 4 of us, will be muted when they come in.
Okay. And we'll just leave it like that, but I'll ask them to turn their cameras on.
I think you could probably give them them the option. They can keep their cameras on if they want.
Oh, right.
Just because I think Chloe made a good point about some people might want to have their videos off because they could get emotional or something like that. So
Yeah, and visual feedback for her. Okay. So speaker view and cameras on. Everyone's muted until, and do comments and questions in the chat.
Yes.
Okay. So among the three of us, do we want one person to communicate chat questions to Chloe?
Andrew, I'd say you should probably do that since you're introducing.
Okay.
And I think what works is you'll keep notes. If it gets very active with the chat, you might need to keep notes so that you're not just constantly scrolling back to see if you missed comments. And I'll keep an eye on it too, but
Okay.
and we'll feel free to interrupt if I think you haven't reached something that has been waiting for a while for it to be addressed.
Okay.
But I think I'd rather spend more time just sort of monitoring the audience.
Okay. I'm going to walk very slowly over to the desk and get a piece of paper and a pen. I'll see you all in an hour or so.
yeah.
I have to remember my mask.
That's right.
So Tammy, you're going to see a press release soon, probably from us. We're going to close the building to the public starting Friday.
Oh.
So we'll let people come in for computer appointments, but otherwise will not be open because the numbers are going up so high. And Chesapeake and Hampton Public Library, I think, decided to reduce services today or maybe tomorrow. And so Friday will be closed except for computer appointments.
Do you know how long? Is it just Friday or?
No, it's until we aren't.
Okay.
I don't really think it's going to affect, I mean, any programming. All the programming was virtual anyway.
Right. Are you guys still working on site or? Okay.
Yeah.
Much as we ever do.
And when we get started, I'm going to turn my video off unless I have something I need to say so that I'm not distracted.
Chloe, are you going to be doing any work with the legislative session that's coming up? I think that's why we scheduled.
Yeah, today it actually started today. So we have our advocacy days planned, and I'm leading our health, family economic security, and trauma and equity policy agenda. We'll be busy.
Has the I don't know, the legislative staff been in touch with people to talk about things that might be going on in the Capitol?
Well, we made our statement for, and we've made our statement, and the things going on in the Capitol has slowed down some of the bill filings and budget amendment filings. But as far as the General Assembly goes, now that it's started, it'll be all virtual. So it'll be our first fully virtual sessions. We're scheduling legislative meetings virtually. Some respond to email, some don't. No one's answering the phone. But some are using Calendly or just requiring constituents to be in meetings. So it's been interesting to navigate, but I'm allowing extra time to schedule meetings. And we're doing it a little differently. We'd have an in-person advocacy day, but we have digital advocacy day for the general public, and then special advocacy cohorts to schedule virtual meetings with outside of social media advocacy.
One of the things that when I was reading over your CV was you participated in the Sorensen Institute. Does that presage elective office in your future?
I do have some future goals to run for public office one day. And in the future, they have their candidate training plan. So you usually want to do that program about 4 to 5 years in advance of running.
Right. Yeah, I've known some people who went to Sorensen, but they went because they were beginning to work on running for elective office.
Yeah, we had a mixed, we had a doctor and one person was into aviation. So it's a really mixed group. Lawyers, of course.
Was that Mark Downey? Do you know the
No.
doctor?
Oh, that's a good question. I cannot remember his name.
Okay.
It's so long. Our group got a little divided when the Black Lives Matter stuff started. So we have our little group chat. Some people left the group chat.
Yeah, yeah.
So
We got to work on that.
All right, it's 2 o'clock. Are we ready to go?
ready to go.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to start admitting people.
Welcome, everyone. We'll wait for just a few more minutes for more folks to come on, and then we'll get started soon. Feel free, while you're waiting, to introduce yourself in the chat. My name is Chloe Edwards with Voices for Virginia's Children. I'm the founder and staff lead of Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia. A pleasure to have you today. Okay, I'll wait 1 more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. We do have a lot planned. Right, welcome. If you want to add one fact about what brought you here today, what specifically interested you, that would kind of help me get a feel of the room too. Welcome, Rebecca. See some familiar faces. Welcome, Corey.
Oh, okay. I see where the people are now.
So Sarah Beth, if you could mute your microphone.
Welcome, Andy, Karen. All right, we'll go ahead and get started to respect everyone's times. Some folks may be running a little late and coming on, and that is all right. So welcome to this racial trauma workshop. With this, what you'll see is themes of both trauma-informed care and equity, which is what the Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia campaign is all about. A little bit about Voices for Virginia's Children. We champion public policies that improve the lives of Virginia's children, especially in the following areas that you see: early care and education, family economic security, foster care and adoption, health and well-being, mental health, trauma-informed care, and equity. We're also privately funded. So what this means is that there's no conflict of interest when it comes to our position as an advocacy organization. We do not directly benefit from any sort of funding. We are a nonprofit, which means we are also nonpartisan. We work with Republicans, Democrats, independents, you name it. We also specialize in coalition building and convening partners and networks when it comes to our issue areas. If you missed my introduction, again, my name is Chloe Edwards with Voices for Virginia's Children, and I am the founder and staff lead for Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia, with the mission to empower marginalized communities in acknowledgement of truth to promote healing, reconciliation, and justice. And what we really focus on is paralleling trauma-informed care and equity to combat systemic inequities and the root cause of trauma. I encourage you all throughout this presentation to also be engaged. Feel free to use the chat. You can use the clap hands function, or when you put emojis in the chat if you'd like. I come from a speak and respond culture, so it makes me feel a little more at home when folks are interactive. So a little more about Voices. We're also home to the Kids Count Data Center. So all of our policy responses are also, I'll pause and pass the mic to Andrew to do an introduction of the program.
I'm sorry, Chloe, I didn't mean to cut you off at that point. My name is Andrew Smith. I am working with the One Book, One Community organization as a partnership between Williamsburg Regional Library and William and Mary. This is our first program. If you'd like to find out more, please go to our website, wrl.org/onebook for more. February 22nd is our centerpiece program with Jason Reynolds going to be joining us for a virtual discussion of Stamped. For those of you who have tried to get your hands on a copy of Stamped from the library, I do want to let you know right now they're all checked out, but we've got, I think, 100 more copies that are on their way. Go ahead and put a hold on it so that you can make sure that you get it. This is a difficult conversation for us to have, and I hope one that is just starting for us as a community and as a country. Stamped and its foundation text, Stamped from the Beginning, are essential texts for everyone to understand that the outpouring of grief and anger at the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, just to name two, and just to name in the last year, are based on 4 centuries of inhuman treatment by white majorities, Black people. We're presenting programs that can only offer a splinter of insight into the gulf between Black Americans' view of the country and that of white Americans. This is not and should not be the end of our discussion of this necessary but controversial and uncomfortable issue. And we hope that William and Mary and Williamsburg Regional Library can be a place for that to continue. I think we all recognize the disparity between the lives and treatments of Black Americans and those of the white majority. There are other hidden effects that are grouped under the term racial trauma, and our speaker, Chloe Edwards, is going to introduce us to that background. Chloe, I'm going to let you take on and introduce yourself to everyone who has joined us. And thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm Chloe Edwards. Again,
Got muted accidentally.
Yeah, someone muted me. I'm our advocacy and engagement manager at Voices and lead our trauma and equity work through the campaign I mentioned. You'll see a few of my accolades and background in the biography if you got a chance to read it, but I won't touch bases on that. But you're welcome to visit our staff page on the Voices page, vakids.org, to learn more about my background. Do you have anything else, Andrew, to add?
No, I just go ahead and take it on, and let's learn about racial trauma and what you can teach us.
Okay, awesome. So we are also home to the Kids Count Data Center, and when you all are thinking of trauma-informed care and equity, it's always important to disaggregate data or categorize data, for another word to use. It's important because that's when you'll get to see the heart of the disparities that exist. And then you can further contextualize data by talking to community members, organizations within that community to kind of understand why the data is the way it is. So we are home to the Kids Count Data Center. Lauren Snellings is our research director and can always guide you through the data. We did just release our Kids Count data book as well as a press release. So it's as recent as this year. So our data follows the census years, which are generally big data years. And you can go to our webpage and read our blogs to read some of that release data. We've also done equity impact statements for this year for our policy agenda. So if you go to vakids.org/racial truth, I'll type it in the chat. You'll get to see under the data section some of our equity impact statements. For trauma and equity, we look at police brutality data, COVID-19 hospitalizations, adverse childhood experiences, maternal infant mortality, and more. So it's very interesting and very informative if you like to read that. I'll talk about a little what kind of guides my lens when it comes to this work, because it's important to look at how your perspective and your life and experiences shape what connects you to the work. So I became interested in children's advocacy specifically as a veteran of Virginia's foster care system through kinship care. My lens is also guided through my ability as a Black woman, my identity as a Black woman. Foster care also comes with some trauma as well. So if any of you are kind of interested in screening the trauma that you've been through, they have the adverse childhood experience screening. And of course, the higher the number, the higher exposure to trauma, but it doesn't necessarily track everything. So I encourage you to be mindful of your experiences as we go through this conversation and look at how that shapes some of your reactions to the information and be in touch with those reactions. This is our agenda for today of what we'll be walking each other through. I first wanted to start off with all that's going on in today's times with a little bit of mindfulness. So I wanted to start off with an honoring of the indigenous lands that we reside on, and acknowledgement that these lands that we currently live on were home to indigenous peoples who were excluded from their ownership of land through manifest destiny in the name of white supremacy. If you are familiar with the indigenous lands that you reside on, feel free to put it in the chat. It's a moment to be mindful that this population faced brutal conditions, diseases that were brought from European countries, from Europeans. They faced rape. They also lost a sense of their culture and their identity through manifest destiny. I currently reside on the Utanan land. If you are familiar with the land that you live on, put it in the chat. And if you're not, it's a good opportunity to do a Google search another time and learn about the culture that used to exist where you currently reside. So I'll give folks some time to do that. All right, and it's okay if you are not familiar. It'll be really interesting to see some of the history of where you live. The next thing that I wanted to do was an honoring of ancestors. We've lost a lot of ancestors this year. I, in particular, want to honor my grandfather, who I lost this year, who took me in at the age of 14 through kinship care, but I also lost him while I was planning Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia. But my grandfather always taught me to be in touch with my truths and unapologetic about it. So if you would like to honor an ancestor, feel free to put it in the chat. You can also speak verbally if you'd like. And what we're gonna do is respond with an ashe, which means so let it be, and the power to make things happen, which is even more pertinent today. For those who may not know how to spell Ashe, that's how you spell it. So feel free to chat an ancestor or verbally if you'd like to honor someone before we get started. Ashe. Ashe. We can also honor all of those who have left us as a result of COVID-19. Ashe. Ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe. Okay, thank you all for participating in that, and feel free to keep going if someone comes to mind that you'd like to honor. So Andrew gave you some background on the content warning. Some of this content may be triggering when describing some of the history that we have. There is history that is difficult to sit in and to hear about. So I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. This workshop is honest, so you'll find that I don't sugarcoat any of the content. I want to make sure everyone has a clear understanding of what I'm presenting, and that's why I choose to do that. You may feel some discomfort as a result of the directness or as a result of the content, and I encourage everyone to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. The goal of this presentation is not to make you comfortable, but instead to sit in our discomfort, acknowledge it. You may also feel some fragility. I encourage you to acknowledge that. It's very normal to feel fragility, but we have to acknowledge privilege and oppression and how that shapes our discomfort. And some people live in discomfort every day because of oppression. Focus on the intention of the workshop. Again, try to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and it's okay to take a break or turn off your screen if you need to. If you do decide to engage in discussion, I have some truth-telling tips. No put downs. It's okay to not respond as well and just sit in your thoughts. Avoid dismissing someone else's experiences, manage your emotional response. And make sure you step up and step down and try not to take too much space if you choose to speak. So this will be part 1. I encourage everyone to use the Mental Health of America Virginia Warm Line. If you are triggered during this presentation, you can take a picture of the screen to keep this number in handy as well if you are triggered later. Now we're going to go through some key definitions, and I encourage everyone to be engaged, and you can name examples of maybe you noticed one of those definitions in practice, or maybe you've experienced it directly. And then also, before I begin, this presentation is usually about 2 hours without engagement and without breaks. I will offer a break midway, so it'll be a little longer, 2.5 hours, but it will also be recorded if you cannot stay on the entire time. So what is trauma-informed care? It's been a buzzword that you may be more familiar with within the past 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 years. Trauma-informed care is a delivery model that is grounded in understanding trauma. It's not what's wrong with you, but instead what's happened to you, recognizing that we all share adversity in our life experiences. And what adversity does when it's repetitive and toxic based on a person's perspective is it can be connected to negative physical, social, and emotional health outcomes for a lifetime, even past your childhood, but it's especially toxic during those childhood years. The goal is to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment over one's life. And the cure to trauma is resiliency. However, I want to note something about this model. The approach often puts the survivor of trauma in a framework that shapes them as a victim. Providers are trained to realize, recognize, respond to trauma, and resist re-traumatization. But while this framework is a great start, it is incomplete. What we have to do is shift to a system that doesn't create trauma or recognize trauma, but a system that combats the root cause of trauma so that people don't have to experience trauma to begin with. We have to move to systems that do not perpetuate trauma, but instead really serve as a preventative model of trauma altogether. Trauma can be triggered by, and this is the adverse childhood experience screening that I was mentioning earlier. Trauma can be triggered by a single event that you see here, such as verbal, physical, sexual abuse, witnessing someone in the household have a substance abuse issue. Or it can be triggered by multiple events or a set of circumstances, but it's important that we don't play trauma war. No one person's trauma is more traumatic than the other. You can't compare and contrast someone's perspective and the way that they have internalized an experience. What racial trauma is, it's an ongoing result of reoccurring traumas, racism, racist bias, and exposure to racist abuse. Racial trauma can have several components that impact a person's life, including their ability to build relationships, concentrate on school or work, and feel safe. This trauma is definitely widespread amongst marginalized populations, in particular Black people in the United States, the majority of whom have expressed that they have experienced some sort of racism. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Ku Klux Klan attack for someone to experience racial trauma. It can be something as subtle as a microaggression, which we'll go into later. Some other key definitions is prejudice, prejudiceness, which is an attitude or misinformation or stereotype about a specific towards an oppressed population. It can be damaging because what it does is deny their individuality as a person. It describes them as their identity rather than what shapes them as a person. Discrimination is unequal treatment of certain members. This can be gender, social class, sexual orientation, etc., different oppressed statuses. White supremacy is an ideology that one race is superior to the other, which creates privilege and oppression altogether. White privilege is the advantage that someone has due to their position as superior in our society, and their treatment of that ultimately creates a caste system where other groups that are marginalized are inferior. And then what I had mentioned was this microaggressions. And note that micro does not imply that these aggressions are small, but rather that they happen at the micro, meaning individual level. Microaggressions can still have an immense impact despite the micro in the definition in word. These are everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental snubs or insults. Whether intentional or unintentional, it communicates hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to the target group in connection with their marginalized group. Cultural, racial, and historical trauma. Family members who may have not experienced the trauma directly can still feel the effects of the event later. Slavery would be an example of that. And when members who share the same identity, such as skin color, sex, gender, orientation, feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event, that leaves permanent marks that impact their memories, it changes their identity in irreversible ways. It grounds their identity formation forever, and it impacts future generations as well. Examples of cultural trauma can also be the Trail of Tears that indigenous peoples faced, as well as the Holocaust. We could even describe COVID-19 as a historical trauma. Is historical that we're all facing right now. Racism is different from what I had referenced earlier as far as prejudice, hatred, or discrimination. It involves one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through institutional policies, practices, etc. It shapes cultural norms and beliefs. It puts values with the superior race, and it ultimately puts the targeted community in an inferior position. I want to note that in order to be racist, you have to have the privilege to be racist. You have to have the superiority to be racist. And so reverse racism isn't a thing. Marginalized communities can be discriminatory, they can be prejudiced, they do not have the privilege to be racist. Racism requires the superior versus the oppressed. And that leads to oppression, which is a systemic subjugation of one social group by a more powerful social group in order for their own economic, social, or political benefit. So here are some examples of trauma and racial trauma. Food insecurity is one. If you happen to live in a rural or urban community, you may also witness food deserts, which means if you did not have transportation, you would not be able to get food. You wouldn't be able to go to a grocery store or a market. So oftentimes you have to pay higher prices for a mini market nearby in order to access food, or you may have to spend money every day to go to a fast food restaurant. And that's also a good example of nutrition access. Just because you have access to food does not mean you have access to nutrition. And then for racial trauma, I also have an example of the George Floyd, who was a victim of police brutality and ultimately jump-started the Black Lives Matter resurfacing of the movement. If some things come to mind of examples of trauma and racial trauma that you've experienced personally or also witnessed, feel free to put it in the chat. The pandemic is also an example of not just a historical trauma, but also a trauma. Another example of racial trauma. Racial trauma can affect several components of a person's life, as I had mentioned previously. This trauma is widespread. An example of this is a research study that was done in 2019 from the Pew Research Survey. Roughly 8 in 10 people who identify as Black with some college experience, 81%, reported that they have experienced some form of racial discrimination from time to time, including 17% who expressed this happens to them regularly. And note that this pattern was consistent across surveys, a 2016 Pew Research survey and a 2017 NPR poll. We've got one example of a microaggression. Where are you from? Said to a friend of mine from an Asian background that Andrew put in the chat. What are some other examples? I can name some examples myself. I'm constantly, people tell me I'm constantly impressed by your professionalism. Well, I am a professional, so that's why that's why I have professionalism. You're so impressive for your age is an example of ageism, but also a microaggression. Feel free to verbally, if you've witnessed a microaggression before, or if you've accidentally even unintentionally used a microaggression, feel free to verbally respond or put it in the chat. You speak well is one. I've gotten that one before too. I've also gotten you sound white when you talk. You act with more maturity than your age. assuming that younger folks are not mature. Good moment of mindfulness, Michelle. You're so articulate, and I have gotten that too. I got that after a job interview. Did get the job though.
Chloe, just out of curiosity, did you address that with your employer after you got the job?
No, I didn't. But I will say now, this year, I've been learning to not just advocate for other people, but advocate for myself. So now when I witness microaggressions or biases, I do speak up, but it can be very tiring, especially if they happen all the time. So encourage others to do that too, especially as more organizations are embracing equity transformations. Right, well, thank you all for sharing. I wanted to name an example of also cultural trauma specific to the Latinx population, and this is the separation at the border. In October of 2020, the New York Times reported that more than 5,500 children in total have been separated from their parents at the United States border under the Trump administration. Researchers are presuming that about 2/3 of the parents now being sought are back in their home countries. Some of the families who have been identified have decided their children would be safer in the United States than in their home countries and elected for their children to stay with friends and families who agreed to sponsor them. While many families did elect to leave their children with friends, they also noted that none of them made the journey to the country with the intention of giving up their children, and most were forced by family separation policies to make impossible decisions. As of October 2019, the government had provided contact information for more than 1,100 additional parents who had been separated from their country before the zero tolerance policy. The government argued that it would not disclose information about the 400 of the parents because those individuals had criminal records that prevented the United States government from reuniting them with their children under Homeland Security policies. The steering committee had been able to locate the parents of 485 belonging to those 1,100 parents. The rest have not been found. And so it just it's an example because cultural and historical trauma did not necessarily occur umpteenth years ago before our births, but it's occurring now. I also wanted to give an example to help you all understand some of the disparities that we see today in public health and in the healthcare system. In the 1840s, Dr. J. Marion Sims spent years conducting experiments on enslaved women. There are only 3 known names, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. Sims outlined the process of negotiating with slave owners. If you give me Anarcha and Betsy for experiment, I agree to perform no experiment or operation on either of them to endanger their lives, and I will not charge a cent for keeping them, but you must pay their taxes and clothe them. These women were property and could not consent. The surgeries were painful. Today in modern medicine, explicitly biased beliefs that Black people have thicker skin and experience less pain continue to impact the experiences of Black patients in an array of forms. Today, Sims is acknowledged to be the founder of modern surgical gynecology. In 2018, New York City removed the statue of Dr. J. Marion Sims from a pedestal in Central Park. Note today that Black women are 3 times more likely to die from childbirth than white women. And this kind of helps provide some context of why these disparities in maternal and infant mortality exist today. The Tuskegee Institute worked with the Public Health Service. The study was named I cannot talk today, you all get what I mean. Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. It involves 600 Black men, 399 with syphilis, and 201 who did not have the disease. The researchers told the men that they were being treated for bad blood, which was a term used to describe ailments that included syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. In exchange, the men were given access to free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance. While the experiment was only projected to last 6 months, it lasted 40 years. What's important about this experiment is that they did not treat the syphilis. And so as a result, numerous men died from this experiment, and it wasn't intervened until 40 years later. The families, the descendants of these families still face the stigma of the affiliation with this experiment and their bloodlines. Then there's this Smithsonian study happened right in Richmond, Virginia, VCU. The Hermes Contis Medical Sciences building located at the intersection of 12th and Marshall Street in Richmond, Virginia, covers a well site discovered in 1994 during the construction of the building. VCU President Eugene P. Trani had the bones and artifacts sent to the Smithsonian Institute for further research. The remains consisted of 9 children and 44 bodies aged 14 years and older. The bodies were used to teach medical students about human anatomy prior to 1860, when the well was capped. This exemplified VCU's participation in the purchasing and theft of bodies of enslaved, dead slaves, and other Black people during the 19th century. And so now we're teaching younger generations through this kind of racist experiment, the devaluing of Black bodies to be one day future surgeons, doctors, whatever they become. But ultimately, when you think of how privilege and oppression and attitudes of superiority are internalized in modern medicine, this is a great example. And well, not so great example, but it's a good example for this purpose of the presentation. Heard the I don't see color thing a lot, so I wanted to address colorblind racism, as I think it is important. And if you all have had any reactions to this presentation so far, feel free to put it in the chat and be mindful of your feelings and of your reactions. But one, I wanted to start off with saying, I have never heard a Black person of color say I don't see color, but perhaps that is because of the network that I affiliate myself with. The idea of a colorblind society, while well-intentioned, leaves people without the language and the skill set to discuss race and examine one's own bias. Colorblindness ultimately relies on the concept that race-based differences don't matter, and it ignores the realities of systemic racism. It tells people of color, well, I don't see color, so your experiences don't exist, instead of getting at the heart of why racism exists in the first place. I'm a good example of colorblind racism through this Facebook status. And I'm sure you all see similar Facebook statuses or Twitter statuses. I have spent more than a decade raising colorblind children who never once questioned the color of anyone's skin. And this is something I have always been proud of until this past week. Recently, they asked me why a bunch of spoiled little white girls were screaming Black Lives Matter on the town greens of the places they always loved. And I could tell that they were confused and scared. So I had to explain to children that sometimes people are so ignorant and uneducated, they need something to make themselves feel self-worth, so they have a reason to bother to breathe any longer. Anyway, thank you, protesters, for correcting my sweet, innocent babies. And by the way, no lives matter. Mother Nature is pissed. So what do you all think of that status? We can pick it apart. Well, one, it's assuming protesters are uneducated in a Black Lives Matter protest. That's a bias in itself, when ultimately education is what leads to the awareness of why these protesters are protesting in the first place. Self-righteous and uninformed, definitely uninformed. And then think of what these children who have lacked the ability to engage in race-based conversations will grow up to think about race. If you don't see the light, then you don't see me. I often ask people, what do you see when you stop at a stoplight? It doesn't even have to say stop. You know what red means, you know what yellow means, you know what green means. And stop sign doesn't even have to say stop. You know what that shape means in red. Some folks have talked to their children about white privilege. That's a good first start. They also have great books that you can get at any age that have themes of cultural representation and diversity. Okay, if you are not speaking, feel free to mute. They're correct because they're standing up for others. So likely more people will just stay silent. All great comments. Other definitions that I'd encourage you to be aware of that we won't go through today because of the interest of time are these. One thing that I like to do in these presentations is give some folks some homework to do in order to engage in their own path of racial awareness and acknowledgement of what these definitions mean in our society. So if you aren't aware with some of these definitions, feel free to write them down and revisit them. Okay. So now I just want to do a check-in. Do we feel like we need a break before part 2? How about keep going? Anyone else? I believe in democracy, so I believe in a say-so. Okay, Karen says she does need a break. Bye, Michelle. Thanks for attending. Okay, well, most people are saying keep going. Let's just go ahead and just break for just 1 minute and then we'll revisit. I'll also put the definitions back on the screen if folks want to look up some of those if you weren't familiar. So we'll come back at 2:45 at the latest. For folks that have to leave, thank you for attending. Okay, I use different colors and words because this is actually not our graphic. It's from Racial Equity Here and Learn. All right, we'll go ahead and keep going. Good use of break, Karen. Right, it's 2:45 now. So what this next component of the presentation will do is analyze a legacy of cultural, racial, and historical trauma. And in order to really understand how cultural, racial, and historical trauma impact us today, we have to peel back the layers of history. So let's start with the history of the United States. The United States is among the most diverse democracies in the world. That's what we're known for. However, much of its history includes systems of violence and discrimination that have not only had traumatic consequences for those directly affected, but it's also affected future generations and communities. Slavery in the United States spanned from the 1600s to the mid-1800s. It's estimated that 6 to 7 million enslaved Africans were imported to the United States during the 18th century alone. The rapid expansion of the cotton industry in the late 1700s and early 1800s made Southern states dependent on slavery, further economic prosperity. Virginia was the second largest state for the importation of enslaved Africans and the #1 state in Richmond was the epicenter of that trade. Richmond's economic success in the antebellum period is largely due to the impact of the slave trade as a commercial enterprise. In fact, in the 1850s, Richmond's biggest business by dollar volume was not tobacco, it wasn't flour or iron, but it was slaves. And so what does it mean to live in the United States of America, known as one of the most diverse democracies in the world? Everyone's welcome here. What does it mean to live in Richmond, the capital? And what does it mean to live in the Virginia, a trailblazer, when it came to a lot of these racist practices? The Constitutional Convention is pictured here. It took place in 1787, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The purpose of the event was to decide how America was going to be governed. On September 17, 1787, 38 of the 41 delegates present concluded the convention. Pictured here includes 7 key figures known as founding fathers: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, George Washington. They played critical and substantial roles in the formation of the government. They were also slaveholders. But pictured here, what you don't see present, well, one, it's all white men. You don't see people of color present. You don't even see women present. What does that mean to our legacy as a inclusive nation when our fundamental core values were created by all white men? Which brings me to America's legacy. These documents represented fundamental American values, including individual rights to life, liberty, property, public good, justice, equality of opportunity, diversity, truth, patriotism, as well as access to the American dream. Yet no Black or brown body was present, no women was present in the crafting of America's legacy as an inclusive nation. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. It would be referred to as a rebuke and a stumbling block to tyranny and oppression. But we saw in that previous photo that exclusion existed itself in our nation's, our nation in the beginning of the creation of our country and our fundamental documents that are birthed to protect us and our individual rights. what slavery entailed. In 1619, the White Lion brought 20 slaves ashore in Jamestown, Virginia. People were kidnapped in the 17th and 18th century from Africa. Some historians estimate 6 to 7 million slaves were imported, depriving Africa, one, from its healthiest and most ablest men and women. Trauma included separation from family, reading and writing restrictions, the raping of enslaved women, brutal punishment, and strict hierarchy among slaves, putting slaves against each other as a culture. And what does it mean to be Black in America, to lose this, some of your identity, to not know where you're from because of slavery, and to not be able to connect with your roots. You're not African necessarily, you're Black, but you also did not choose to be African American. You were subjugated to that. Slave codes, the increasing number of Black slaves in colonial America created suspicion and fear amongst the general population, especially after Nat Turner, the rebellion. Virginia was the first of 13 colonies to adopt these regulations, a trailblazer again. Other colonies quickly followed suit, patterning the codes after Virginia laws. After the Revolutionary War, most states, especially those in the South, developed new slave codes. Slaves could not, for example, leave the plantation without their master's permission, strike a white person even in self-defense, buy or sell goods or hire themselves out, or visit the homes of whites or free Blacks. Enslaved patrols, thinking of the founding of our police department, were used to enforce these slave codes. White men took turns overseeing particular areas in order to catch runaway slaves and enforcing the rules. And we'll also go to broken windows of policing a little later and talk about criminal justice. President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. It would be stating, "shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free," a rebellion against the Union. Black Americans were unable to celebrate the abolishment of slavery until June 19th, 1865, known as Juneteenth, an annual holiday that commemorates the end of slavery in the United States, and a holiday that is now recognized in Virginia as a state holiday. Southern states then enacted another series of laws intended to circumscribe the lives of Americans. Mind you, white folks were dependent upon the free labor of slaves in general, and the country was still dependent upon oppression in order to be economically stable. These codes were harsh contract laws that penalized folks for attempting to leave a job before an advance had been worked off. Freed slaves were also poor, and it penalized poor African Americans for crimes such as stealing a farm animal. Vagrancy statutes also made it a crime to be unemployed. So a lot of people had to go right back to their slaveholder and work for them again in order to not go to jail. Many misdemeanors or trivial offenses were treated as felonies with harsh sentencing and fines. These laws were ultimately created to surveillance Black people and further enslave them through practices such as convict leasing, which we'll go into a little later. It did make some laws legal, such as marriage, ownership of property, and limited access to the courts, but it also denied them the right to testify against whites, serve on juries or in state militias, vote, or start a job without the approval of a previous employer. Most of us think that the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation ended with slavery, but that's not exactly true. Embedded in the 13th Amendment, which officially freed all Americans, is a problematic loophole. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. It's that middle bit that was used to continue a modified form of slavery for some 60 years after Blacks were made free. And the same themes of that are still deeply ingrained in our society, which I'll share some examples right after this slide. For Southern whites now without their former workforce, there was a clear upside to convicting as many Blacks as possible. Laws, especially around vagrancy, were quickly enacted to target African Americans. In North Carolina, for instance, people without jobs could be sent to court. If they could pay a fine, they were dismissed for a year. If not, they were deemed a vagrant and in prison. Newly freed slaves came with a clause, however, they must return to their former masters under contract or be leased to a corporation for hard labor. After vagrancy laws were in place, a system called convict leasing emerged across the South. For example, in 1883, 10% of Alabama's revenue came from the labor of convicts. By 1898, it had reached 73%. Entrepreneurs began buying and selling convict labor for profit. As the money-making potential increased, the incentive to arrest Blacks and poor whites, of course, grew. Officials claimed Black convicts were better off in this kind of servitude. Old habits were kicked by learning a trade. They would leave prison having been exposed to rigid discipline and regular hours, but there was little incentive to treat convicts well once they were released out to work on a plantation or in a mine. After all, the lessers had little interest in convicts' long-term health, and by law, they were no longer entitled to their offspring. Convict death rates were 10 times higher in states with lease programs. In 1873, 25% of Black convicts died. Secret graveyards were common. This practice still exists and has contributed to modern slavery through the privatization of prisons and the prison industrial complex. Today, African Americans are incarcerated at nearly 6 times the rate of whites, constituting 1 million of the roughly 2.3 million people in jail. And inmates are required to work jobs. We'll kind of go into some examples of that. These are 12 major companies benefiting from the prison industrial complex. Okay, we have a question. Black code synonymous with Jim? No, they are not synonymous with Jim Crow laws. So McDonald's, Walmart, Victoria's Secret, Fidelity Investments, Wendy's, Starbucks, Sprint, Verizon, JCPenney, and Kmart, Airlines, and Avis. As you all do your shopping in the future, you can be mindful that they all invest in the prison industrial complex prison labor. They also receive a tax credit for their investment, at $2,400 for every work release inmate that an employee has, because they are employing risky target groups. The workers are not only cheap labor, but they are considered easier to control. They also tend to be African American males. Companies are free to avoid providing benefits like health insurance or sick days. They also don't need to worry about unions' demands for vacation time, raises, or family issues. According to the Left Business Observer, the federal prison industry produces 100% of all military helmets, war supplies, and other equipment. The workers supply 98% of the entire market for equipment, assembly services, 93% of paints and paintbrushes, 92% of stove assembly, 46% of body armor, 36% of home appliances. We could go on. With all of that productivity, the inmates make about 90 cents to $4 a day. So thinking of themes of deaths that we've witnessed in the news of inmates, thinking of the disparities that exist in the criminal justice system for Black and Latinx communities, that all started with convict leasing, and we still witness those themes today. Now we get to Jim Crow. In legal theory, Blacks received separate but equal treatment. That was the disenfranchisement laws known as Jim Crow. It represented a codified system of racial apartheid that dominated the American South. The laws affected almost every aspect of daily life, mandating segregation in schools, parks, libraries. In addition, Blacks were systematically denied the right to vote in most of the rural South through the selective application of literacy tests and other racially motivated criteria. The separation ultimately made Blacks feel inferior to the rest of the population. The Jim Crow system was upheld by local government officials and reinforced by acts of terror perpetuated by vigilantes. In 1896, the Supreme Court established the doctrine separate but equal in Plessy versus Ferguson, after a Black man in New Orleans attempted to sit in a whites-only railway car. Travel in the South in the segregated South for Black people was humiliating, recalled Diane Nash in her interview for Freedom Writers, PBS interview. The very fact that there were separate facilities was to say Black people and white people, that Blacks were so subhuman and so inferior that we could not even use the public facilities that white people use. If you're interested in how this is perpetuated today, I encourage you to read The New Jim Crow, which is a book written by Mitchell Alexander. The New Jim Crow today, an extraordinary percentage of the African American community is warehoused in prisons or trapped in a parallel social universe, denied basic civil and human rights, including the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, and the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. And we'll go into some of that a bit later. Now we can talk about broken windows policing, as I had flagged the slave patrol earlier. Police brutality in the United States is the unwarranted or excessive and often illegal use of force against civilians by the United States Police. Forms of police brutality have ranged from assault and battery, beatings, mayhem, torture, and murder. Broader definitions include false arrest, intimidation, verbal abuse, amongst other treatments. Black men and boys are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police over the course of their lifetime. According to a Rutgers University study, police killings are the 6th leading cause of death among men of all races, ages 25 to 29. The proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences reported that about 1 in 1,000 Black men and boys will be killed over the course of their lifetime. This is 2.5 times higher than that of a white man. According to the research done by that same organization, the study found that police killings represent 1.6% of all deaths of Black men aged 20 to 24. In comparison, among white men, police are responsible for 0.5% of all deaths in that age group. The study, so you see the disparity there, 1.6% versus 0.5. The study author stated that finding these resources reinforces a call to treat police violence as a public health issue with profound consequences. Broken windows policing is a metaphor for any visible signs of disorder in an environment that goes unintended. An example of that would be something as small as a broken window, or something as small as, for example, jaywalking. If you tackle that through your policing, it'll prevent larger crimes. That's the argument of this metaphor. What it does is implement a zero tolerance policing policy, especially in minority communities. It also led to controversial practices such as stop and frisk, and an increase in police conduct complaints. Broken windows policing includes small acts of vandalism, crimes, drunken or disorderly conduct. We see that in the schools too, school to prison pipeline. Being forced to confront minor problems can ultimately heavily influence how people feel about their environment, sure, and their sense of safety. But what it ultimately does is, why do we see more police in predominantly communities of color than white communities, such as the suburbs? So it again contributes to disparity. Virginia schools continue to use exclusionary discipline with very young students at an astonishing rate. If you're interested in this topic, the school to prison pipeline, I'd encourage you to read the Legal Aid Justice Center Suspended Progress Report. Virginia Public Schools issued over 127,800 out of school suspensions to over 73,000 individual students. Black students were 4.5 times more likely to be suspended than Latinx and white students, up significantly from 3.8 times more likely in the 2015 to 16 academic year. So breaking down this history a little more, which takes me to remember those Black codes that we talked about and those slave codes that prevented things such as voting from occurring. Well, that leads to voter suppression today. This includes voter ID laws, voter registration restrictions, voter purges, not being able to vote if you have a felony, gerrymandering. Suppression efforts range from the seemingly unobstructive laws like cuts to early voting, deadlines to voter registration would also be an example, mass purges of voter rolls. We see that trying to occur now with our presidential election. And long before election cycles even begin, legislators can redraw district lines that determine the weight of your vote. Certain communities are particularly susceptible to this. In some cases, outright targeted. We see Georgia being targeted today. People of color, students, the elderly, and people with disabilities are often going to be your populations targeted. 70% of Georgia voters purged in 2018 were Black. Across the country, 1 in 13 Black Americans cannot vote due to disenfranchisement laws. 1/3 of voters who have a disability report difficulty voting because of access. Only 40% of polling places fully accommodate people with disabilities. Across the country, counties with large minority populations have fewer polling sites and poll workers per voter. 6 in 10 college students come from out of state. For example, in New Hampshire, the state tried to block residents with out-of-state driver's license. And when I mention gerrymandering, this can be done in a partisan way. The belief that the suburbs in this district will likely vote Republican. The cities over here will likely vote Democrat. And so the lines are drawn like that. So you can guess the outcome of the election. And then it can also be done racially, racial gerrymandering. There was a few court cases that occurred in Virginia as recent as last year that you all can look up if you're more interested in that. Is the school suspension related to the increase of families not being able to keep at home, feed the family, and have parents? So there's I'm not quite sure what's being asked. School suspension rates I would encourage you to read the report. It breaks down certain populations such as Black and Latinx children, as well as students with disability are more targeted for school suspensions, also IEP students. So although American public policies had intentionally displaced people of color for centuries prior, 2 of the most well-known examples are the Indian Removal Act and the Dawes Act. President Andrew Jackson signed, and this was in the name of a manifest destiny, the belief that white settlement across North America, it was inevitable, even ordained by God, that white folks colonized these populations. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law in 1830, authorizing the federal government to forcibly relocate Native Americans in the Southeast in order to make room for white settlement. For the next 2 decades, thousands of Native Americans died of hunger, disease, and exhaustion on a forced march west of the Mississippi River, a march now known as the Trail of Tears. Decades later, in 1887, President Grover Cleveland signed into law the General Allotment Act, better known as the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act forcibly converted communally held tribal lands into small, individually owned lots. The federal government then seized 2/3 of the reservation lands and redistributed the land to white Americans. Native American families who were allotted land were encouraged to take up agriculture, despite the fact that much of the land was unsuitable for such. The result was the erosion of tribal traditions, the displacement of thousands of families, and the loss of 90 million acres of valuable land. But the systemic removal of Native Americans did not end in the 1800s. Between 1945 and 1968, federal laws terminated more than 100 tribal nations. It placed them under state jurisdiction, contributing to the loss of millions of additional acres of tribal land. During this period, lawmakers again encouraged Native Americans to relocate, this time from reservations to urban centers, resulting in economic hardships and housing instability. While tribal nations have experienced a resurgence in self-governance and self-determination in recent decades, the legacy of displacement, oppression, and neglect in American public policy affects Native communities today. Native people endured some of the highest levels of financial insecurity in the country. In 2017, more than 1 in 5 American Indian and Alaskan Native people, 22%, lived in poverty, compared with just 8% of white Americans. Native American people are also less likely than their white counterparts to own their own homes and more likely to be burdened by the cost of housing. Ultimately, this community was stripped of land, wealth, and opportunity. A similar theme goes into redlining and housing inequities. In 1933 and 1934, in the midst of the Great Depression, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed into law the Home Owners Loan Act and the National Housing Act, referred to as HOLC. The law prevented foreclosures and made rental housing and home ownership more affordable. So on paper, a great law, right? But these maps assess risk in part based on a neighborhood's racial composition, designing predominantly non-white neighborhoods as hazardous and coloring these areas that you see here red. The process was known as redlining. It denied people of color, especially Black people, access to mortgage, refinancing, and federal underwriting opportunities, while perpetuating the notion that residents of color were financially risky and a threat to local property values. As a result, just 2% of the $120 billion in FHA loans distributed between 1934 to 1962 were given to non-white families. Today, approximately 3 in 4 neighborhoods, 74% that the HOLC deemed hazardous in the 1930s, remain low to moderate income. More than 60% are predominantly non-white. In short, while federal intervention and investment has helped expand home ownership and affordable housing for countless white families, it has undermined wealth building in Black communities. Another example of this is President Roosevelt's 1944 GI Bill, which provided a range of benefits such as guaranteed mortgages to veterans of World War II. However, the law was deliberately designed to accommodate Jim Crow. For instance, the GI Bill allowed local banks to discriminate against Black veterans and deny them home loans, even though the federal government would guarantee their mortgages. In Mississippi, for example, just 2 of the 3,000 mortgages that the Veterans Administration guaranteed in 1947 went to African Americans, despite the fact that African Americans constituted half of the state's population, disproportionate. While the GI Bill paved the way for millions of predominantly white veterans to enter the middle class, it further entrenched the United States racial hierarchy. Color of law, great suggestion. So just as trauma is multidisciplinary, so is racial trauma. So what do you think some of the adverse impacts of these experiences are? I see some folks have already provided some comments on the chat. Right, well, we saw some themes, labor patrols to going into broken windows, policing, the privatization of prisons, convict leasing leading to now prison labor, etc. So as we pick apart history, think of today's modern context that you can connect it to when it comes to disparities you're witnessing in the community or at the state or federal level. So now this is the last component of the training where we're going to analyze the impact at an individual level through stress disorders, systemically, institutionally, and then we'll go at the individual level last. So let's think about the systemic impact. And this comes to political representation and politics, and also has a lot to do with the voter suppression that I mentioned, because ultimately voter suppression does contribute to representation in politics culturally, which is what I'm referencing. In the House and Senate, at least 114 lawmakers are either African American, Asian, or Hispanic, meaning that more than 1 in 5 lawmakers in the 116th Congressional Congress is a person of color, and nearly 8 in 10 are white. The data also shows there are far more Democratic than Republican people of color. If we break it down by race, Black, 53 representatives, 3 senators. Asian American, 12 representatives, 3 senators. Latinx American, 39 representatives, 4 senators. Since 1870, 162 African Americans have served in Congress, according to the congressional data from every CRS report. Of those, 152 have served in the House, while 9 have served in the Senate. 1 has served in both chambers. Though both chambers appear to be getting more diverse with each election cycle, the number of white lawmakers still remain disproportionate to the racial breakdown of Americans in the United States. The United States Census Bureau estimates that in 2019, 6.4% of Americans identified as white only, excluding those who identify as Latinx. But about 79% of Congress is white, according to Brookings Institute data. When we look at the systemic disparities that exist, 19% of children in Virginia experience 2 or more adverse childhood experiences, but Black children experience trauma at almost double that rate. And this includes racist bias in this data. From 2017 to 2018, 37% of Black children experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences, in comparison to 18% Latinx, 15% non-Hispanic white, while 19%, the overall rate, experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. Now, this includes socioeconomic hardship, parental divorce, death, incarceration, family violence, neighborhood violence, living with someone with a mental illness or suicidal, living with someone who has a substance abuse problem, and racial bias. Communities of color are experiencing much higher COVID-19 related hospitalization rates. As of December 3rd, the Virginia Department of Health reported 15,116 hospitalizations. While the Black community accounts for about 29% of that group, they represent just 19% of the Commonwealth's population. Likewise, the Latinx population makes up roughly 24% of Virginia's COVID-19 hospitalizations, but only 9.8% of the population, disproportionate. Meanwhile, while the white community accounts for 38% of the Commonwealth's coronavirus hospitalizations, but nearly 70% of the state's population, not disproportionate. Communities of color are experiencing much higher hospitalization rates. Black communities have almost a 10% hospitalization rate compared to the 6% average, disproportionate. So I'm pleased that we'll do have an opportunity in Virginia to declare racism as a public health crisis. Delegate Aird is championing a resolution which will have some concrete policy priorities into place, such as examining a category of definitions, community engagement with communities most impacted, implicit bias training for public officials and folks who work within public entities. And while it's only a first step, it is an opportunity for Virginia to want to, just as they were leading the importation of slaves, we can reconcile that wrong through declaring racism as a public health crisis and lead in that arena. So if you go to our website, bakids.org, and or the racial truth link that I put in earlier, you'll be able to view our policy agenda. Now we're going to go into the institutional impact. And while I named racism as a public health crisis as one of the systematic impacts, there's still other examples like the war on drugs that had a clear bias in predominantly Black communities through broken windows policing, as well as if you look at the temporary assistance for needy families in Virginia, there was a child cap of the benefit. If you had more than one child within a certain amount of time, you would not qualify for TANF. Those are examples of biases in laws. A clear example would be 40 quarters where immigrants cannot access Medicaid if they do not have more than 10 years of work experience in Virginia, even though that's not the federal requirement at the federal level. We did make some policy progress with that and are waiting on federal approval to diminish that requirement to 5 years. Now, when we look at the institutional impact, the white savior industrial complex refers to the institutional mergings of practices and processes that ultimately validate white privilege. Slavery is an example of that ideology. It reflects racial trauma that began over 400 years ago. The belief that people of color need saving often disregards the potential people of color have to transform oppressive conditions within their own social context. A direct example of this social harm the white savior industrial complex causes is the orphans taken from other countries from their parents to local agencies in order to meet the demands of Western adoption, of Western adopted parents. Note that when I say this, I am not referring to interracial adoptions. What I'm referring to is the exploitation of the international adoption field, where parents are offered incentives to give up their child because they live in poverty, and it forces them to make decisions that are impossible to make. Do I choose poverty, or do you choose giving up your child? There's also orphans that are stolen from parents to also meet the demands of Western adoption in America. Realistically, communities of color are well off without the interventions of white saviorship. For example, Black Wall Street portrays the potential Black communities of color have. It was the wealthiest community in the United States, but in 1921, it was destroyed by the Tulsa Race Massacre and burned down by white mobs. Black and brown people know that they have the potential in their communities to overcome oppression, but this potential is often limited by the perpetuation of privilege within institutions. Another example of the white savior industrial complex outside of the adoption analogy would be the mission trips that churches take to predominantly countries of color in the name of preaching morality and the goodwill of God, but ignoring the impoverished conditions that exist in their own backyard right here in the States. Another form is the nonprofit industrial complex. Despite recent calls to stand against hate, the history of racist organizing at its root is about more fear than hate in the nonprofit sector. As the United States entered the 1940s and World War II, people found it increasingly important to band together to serve communities in need. During that time, the United States government increased their involvement in the nonprofit sector by providing significant grant funding and contracts to organizations such as the Red Cross, who were largely white-led due to Jim Crow laws and other policies that made Black Americans second-class citizens. While these organizations serve their communities in some very important ways that we will not diminish, it did not address the underlying racist policy Black people faced and often perpetuated them. As the country moved into the 1960s and 70s, the United States experienced both the civil rights movement and the creation of the IRS tax code known as 501c3. The civil rights movement exemplified that Black communities knew how to organize and serve their communities, but they were not given equal opportunity to do so. In this era of the nonprofit sector, government programs and organizations made it more difficult to serve people of color by creating unnecessary guidelines to receive services. We continue to see the impact of this in programs today, such as the temporary assistance for needy families mentioned previously, which creates a poverty cliff so steep that the program penalizes individuals as they strive towards economic self-sufficiency. While this is not a complete list of every history marker that has played a role in why the nonprofit sector continues to be predominantly white, for example, it does help shed light on how we got here. It refers to the monitoring and control of social justice movements. It redirects activist energies into career-based modes of organizing instead of mass-based organizing capable of actually transforming society. It allows corporations to mask their exploitative and colonial work practices through philanthropic work. It encourages social movements to model themselves after capitalist structures rather than challenging them. Ultimately, what it equates to is a management and a monitoring of political movements. And that's not to discredit the entire nonprofit sector, as we recognize that the nonprofit sector does good work, but we have to recognize the institutional biases that exist, including racism and the lack of cultural representation. So I'd encourage you all that as nonprofits are speaking up to what's going on at the Capitol and speaking up when it comes to the death of George Floyd, look at their board and is it diverse? Does it represent the community they serve? Look at the leadership of their organization. Is it culturally diverse? Does it represent the community they serve? And then look at frontline workers at that nonprofit, lower level workers, more likely does represent the community served, but do not have access to to leadership positions, which would equate to more of a say-so in the direction of the work that they do. I think I already went through the white savior and industrial complex. Yeah, I did. So now we'll go to the individual impact, implications, and symptoms. Epigenetics is a study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work, unlike genetic changes. Epigenetic changes are reversible. They do not change your DNA sequence, but they can challenge how your body reads DNA sequence. Animal studies, mainly carried out on mammals like rats, prove that an emotional environment early on in pregnancy or after childbirth can lead to epigenetic changes for a lifetime. Studies show that those baby rats that are groomed and licked a lot by their mother tend to have less anxiety and stress as adults. In humans, the cortisol receptor, which is the stress response in the fetus's brain, receives these signals, and the changes take place according to those signals. Children who suffer from abuse or experience prenatal stress tend to have similar epigenetic changes. However, if babies are groomed well, kept in a loving environment and close to the warmth of their parents, they grow up to be less anxious and stressed. So when I was talking about how historical and cultural trauma is passed down through generations, this is an example of how it even impacts your DNA sequence, but it is reversible. And the cure to trauma is resilience. Post-traumatic stress disorders is the next series that we'll go through. It's a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event, either experiencing or witnessing it. Symptoms could include flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts about the event. PTSD contributes to a pattern of behaviors and beliefs impacting those who were enslaved, their communities, and their descendants today, in addition to their oppressors, which we'll talk about. Dr. Joy DeGruy, who's my shero, often references how white people have also been impacted by this traumatic legacy of multi-generational violence, racial superiority, and the justification of 500 years of trauma and dehumanization that Europeans and their descendants and their institutions produced. The first stress disorder is perpetration-induced stress disorder, the traumatic stress, the psychological consequence of violence against human beings on the person perpetuating the violence. The second is post-traumatic mistress syndrome, which describes the interactions of white women with imperialist white supremacists and patriarchal capitalism and the collective struggle that lies at the intersection of race, gender, and class that white women cope with. It's specific to white women to undo the historical legacy connected to post-traumatic master syndrome, an interlocking and overlapping partnership that has kept violence unnamed, normalized, and securely in place, both inside and outside of the big house on the plantation. When we say white women, I'm not necessarily referring to a personal identity. I'm referring to a dominant or mainstream identity with certain images, messages, and narratives that have been used to uphold systems of oppression. It is an identity that many who have experienced socialization as white and female often have to negotiate with, whether it be resisting, conforming, imitating, subverting, or distancing yourself from your status as as superior, but also as oppressed because of your gender. What we're investigating or negotiating is the relationship that white women have between those two identities, or personal or political connection to the effects of the identity. Mistress syndrome is part of a lifelong journey of personal and collective healing from the multi-layered generational trauma of what it means to be a white woman in America. Now, post-traumatic slave syndrome, PTSS, is a theory that explains the adaptive and survival behaviors that African American communities throughout the United States and diaspora have adopted in order to coexist. It's a condition that exists as a consequence of the multi-generational oppression of African Americans and their descendants resulting from chattel slavery. It's a form of slavery that's predicated on the belief that African Americans were inherently and genetically inferior to whites. This was then followed by institutional racism, which continues to perpetuate injury, thus resulting in multi-generational trauma and continued oppression, absence of opportunity to heal or access benefits available to society, and leading to post-traumatic slave syndrome. Key patterns of behaviors reflective of PTSS includes a vacant esteem and insufficient development of self-esteem, along with feelings of hopelessness, depression, and a general self-destructive look on life. Propense anger and violence, extreme feelings of suspicion to assume negative motivation of others, violence against self, property, and others, including members of one's own group, friends, relatives, acquaintances, can be impacted. Racist socialization or internalized racism, aversion or distorted self-concept, literacy deprivation, learned helplessness. The members of one's own identified culture or ethnic group can be impacted by those. And I always think it's important to talk about racial essentialism. And I want to use Shakespeare as an example, because I had to read this racist book in school. I'm also an English major and a social justice minor. Essentialism is derived from a doctrine established by Aristotle. And I'm going to get to the theme of it in The Tempest, which is Shakespeare's book. The doctrine suggested that all objects have internal properties titled essences, which explains how properties can be grouped into categories. This ultimately gets at the heart of why slavery existed. There are two different approaches to essences. One approach is that essences are the defining factor of one's category membership. The other is that essences are properties that are inherited by category members. Applied to race, features can include characteristics such as skin color, aggressiveness, or intelligence. In Aristotle's piece titled Politics, reason and rationality are the distinguishing factors that categorize humans from animals. Now, this theory applied to racial hierarchies and relations, Aristotle outlines natural hierarchy as the determinant of who is categorized as the ruler and who is categorized as the slave. Those naturally capable of reason were natural masters versus those naturally capable of physical effort under the direction of the reasoned were natural slaves. Masters are associated with essentialist characteristics such as civil, whereas slaves are given animalistic characteristics such as savage. The ideology behind certain racial groups lacking reason was a common justification for slavery. To humanize slavery, it was argued that slaves had an innate lack of capacity for reason and culture requiring institutional enforcement. For example, in the 18th and 19th century, many states in the American South used the power of legislation to enforce significant fines against anyone educating slaves. Racial essentialism exists in textbooks taught institutionally, for example, The Tempest. Caliban in The Tempest versus Ariel. Caliban has no power and has no language or rationality. Ariel is an indentured servant, loyal, and gains freedom. European colonists used the word white to refer to people who looked like themselves, grew to become entangled with the word race and slave in American colonies in the mid-1600s. These elites created races of savage, such as Indians, subhuman, such as Africans, and white men. The social invention succeeded in uniting white colonists, dispossessing and marginalizing Native people, and permanently enslaving African descendant people for generations. Tragically, American culture from the very beginning developed ideas of race and racism. So when we go back to that I don't see color thing or statement, we have to remember that race was a social construction that is now implemented in society. And as a result, race does exist and it has real implications and affiliations when it comes to how we describe people of color in mainstream media versus white people. Such as when you see Black Lives Matter protesters, it's all of a sudden a riot. But then when we talk about white people protesting, it's a demonstration. And then there's white slaveholder religion. It's the religion that the slaveholder equated with the power of God. They equated their master position with the power of God. It was ordained through God. And religion was also used to moralize slavery so that white people didn't have to deal with the white guilt. I have a transcript that I'll read. On Easter Sunday in 1873, white men in Colfax, Louisiana massacred over 100 Black freedmen. The freedmen were defending the courthouse where their fragile, newly gained freedom was being legally protected. The intent of the massacre was the reassertion of white power over former slaves The white men in Colfax would find their act of violence imitated by others who also rejected the post-Civil War social order known as Reconstruction. To them, the thought of living as equals with former slaves was not just wrong, it was against what they understood to be the will of God. It's no wonder then that they called themselves redeemers and chose to be a theologically pregnant term redemption to define their movement. One person that you can look up is Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, director of the School for Conversion. He added yet another perspective to address how racism appears in communities when talking about white slaveholder religion. Understand it is the way that we were inherited. We have inherited a theology that justifies a system that was set up to exploit Black labor. And that system has morphed and changed over the years, but it is the root of inequality that we see in our society today, including health inequities. For some people, that means they feel a moral duty to uphold that system that existed. For others who are often on the receiving end, religion becomes a way of controlling and internalizing a sense of guilt, shame about the challenges faced. I try to expose the lies of slaveholder religion, but also recover faith as a source of resilience in knowing that we have the power to change these systems. Slaveholders and their allies use the Bible to support their arguments in favor of slavery and of an economic system dependent upon slave labor. They were even forced to teach it to each other, teach the Bible to each other, and there are some master slave ideologies in the Bible. The patterns we inherited from the 19th century are with us still. Slaveholder religion has taken a spiritual toll on the United States. There's a split, it splits the gospel in two and it warps us. The faith that was at the heart of the civil rights movement, however, is still with us. And then there's Frederick Douglass transcript there who gave you a master and a mistress. God gave them to me. Who says that you must obey them? God says that I must. What book tells you these things? The Bible. So for those who are deeply familiar with the Bible, that those slave master ideologies were used to moralize slavery, and that it still exists in some religions when we witness the split, while folks may be all Christian, but not the same kind of Christian. And then that takes me to Amazing Grace. And this may be triggering. Reverend John Newton wrote Amazing Grace. The song was written by a former enslaver. After joining the Navy, Newton renounced his faith and plotted to kill his shipmates. He was so difficult to work with. The crew of the Harwich decided to transfer him to a different route in India. This was a slave trader route. The change in ships did not suit Newton's temper. They then decided to leave him in West Africa during one of its slave missions. During that journey, Newton connected with an actual enslaver. He joined the crew of a slave ship and openly challenged the captain by creating catchy songs about him, filled with curses and language unlike anything anyone had ever heard. Sailors were known for their foul mouths, but Newton's was so bad, the slaver's captain almost starved him to death for it. In this work, Newton learned how he was a wretch due to the participation in the North Atlantic slave trade. In life, he set out to abolish it in England. Newton connected with William Wilberforce, the British parliamentarian who led the charge against slavery in Britain and ended it in the empire in 1807. Amazing Grace has been sung at several funerals and Black American church services. Even President Obama sang it at this service for South Carolina State Senator Clementa Pinckney, who was one of the 9 Black people murdered in cold blood by Dylann Roof. Newton was candid about his disregard of the enslaved, however. He called them lesser creatures without Christian souls and describes how naked African women and girls were prey for sexual abuse on the slave ships, in which he admittedly took part in. Take a moment to think about how twisted it is that a man who wrote this song that has given so many Black people comfort and strength in times of need, used his Christian faith to justify the inhumane treatment of Black people. The irony is that Newton expressed regret for his anti-Black brutalities yet it still centered his own story around his own redemption, not the story of those who were the victims of the violence. It's no wonder many people don't know the history behind the hymn, Amazing Grace. He never even bothered to mention the story of the slave woman he raped, because it's all about the grace that God gives him. Another component is that all of the aforementioned leads to is white fragility and reverse racism. White fragility is about the discomfort many of you may have felt during this presentation. You may feel an innate need to be defensive on the part of your identity, the white person, when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. However, I know in talking about white fragility and the discomfort that topics like this leads to, that can also be overcome by what led each of you to this presentation today. What white fragility also tends to lead to is reverse racism, often pulled by the white person when people of color call out racism, or for example, microaggressions that, for example, BET having its own space, or us having a Black History Month. The impulse behind the reverse racism argument seems to be a desire to prove that people of color don't have it that bad. They're not the only ones that are put at a disadvantage or targeted. It's like the racism Olympics. So I have this quote from one of my favorite shows, Dear White People, which says, Black people can't be racist, prejudiced, yes, but not racist. Racism describes a system of disadvantage based on race. Black people cannot be racist since we don't stand to benefit from such system. So reverse racism is actually not a real thing. And then there's internalized racism, and this is often experienced by the oppressed culture. I'll give you an example. It ultimately leads to minimizing, finding fault, and validating oneself, devaluing your culture in yourself. And a good example of it is the Brown versus Board of Education doll experiment. This was used for the separate but equal segregation in the United States argument. They considered Black and white baby dolls unexpected weapons in the plaintiff's fight against racial discrimination. The dolls were part of a group of groundbreaking psychological experiments performed by Mamie and Kenneth Clark, a husband and wife team of African-American psychologists who devoted their life's work to understanding and helping heal children's racial biases. During the doll test, as they're now known, a majority of African-American children showed a preference for dolls with white skin instead of Black ones, a consequence, the Clarks argued, of the inadvertent effects of segregation. Ultimately, this was what broke apart the case and made Brown versus Board of Education successful, separate but equal segregation successful to combat that. But what it also showed is how racism was internalized at an early age, so we can't say that children don't understand race or the implications of that. And then there's imposter syndrome. It's where you may feel like a fraud or an imposter. It's a psychological pattern in which you doubt your skills, talents, or accomplishments due to internalized fear. And I asked, why do you think minority communities face this? It's a syndrome that I face myself too. You have different types, the perfectionist, the expert, the soloist, the superwoman taking on everything. And if you can't handle it all, you undermine yourself. The great mind, where if you have to ask for help, you feel you aren't as intelligent as you thought you were. If you feel as if you were really intelligent, it would come naturally and quickly. Many folks are familiar with the perfectionist, and then there's the expert, where you feel as if you were really smart, you would know how to do what you're trying to do without having to research or develop some sort of support system. This often can be derived from the constant microaggressions that folks face. It can be derived from institutional racism, not moving up in the field that you're working in because of the way racist bias works, not landing an interview, even though you may be overqualified for that interview. And so that can lead to imposter syndrome, but this is not necessarily a race-based syndrome. Other communities can also succumb to this. Now we're going to get into the last component, which is being the solution. When we're talking about how we can combat structural racism, it starts with equity and equality. Note that equality says, well, I'm going to give each of you, I have this stool as an example. Each of you get a stool. Person who's 6 foot gets the same stool. Person who's 4'11" gets the same stool. The person who's 5'11" gets the same stool. But we see that in order to reach the apple on the tree, those who may be shorter may need a little taller stool, and those who may be taller may need a shorter stool because they can reach the apple on the tree more easily. Equality has to do with giving everyone the exact same resources, whereas equity involves distributing resources based on the needs of the recipients. And so as we're structuring our systems, it may not be a matter of giving all communities the same resources, but realizing that communities that are oppressed need different resources in order to truly be equal. Going back to trauma-informed care, it has limitations. People are more than just what happened to them. They're not just their trauma. While the term trauma-informed care is important, it is incomplete. First, trauma-informed care correctly highlights the specific needs for individual people who have exposure to trauma. However, current formulations of trauma-informed care presume that the trauma is an individual experience rather than a collective one. To illustrate this point, researchers have shown that children in high violence neighborhoods all display behavioral and psychological elements of trauma. Similarly, populations that disproportionately suffer from disasters like Hurricane Katrina share a common experience that, if viewed individually, simply fails to capture how collective harm requires a different approach than an individual one. Second, trauma-informed care requires that we treat trauma in people, but provides very little insight into how we might address the root cause of trauma in neighborhoods and families and schools. If trauma is collectively experienced, this means that we have to also consider the environmental context that caused the harm in the first place. By only treating the individual, we only address part of the equation, leaving the toxic systems, policies, and practice neatly intact. The other thing to note is that we cannot portray people as a victim. Communities that have endured high levels of adversity have the ability to be resilient and overcome their traumas. So it's not necessarily what's wrong with you. It's not necessarily what happened to you, but it's also asking what's right with you, recognizing the power within communities that are oppressed, and seeing them as agents in creating their own well-being rather than victims of traumatic events. In this context of how we can combat systemic racism, we also have to talk about reparations. There is a 10-point reparations plan. If you're really interested in this, I don't know what the acronym stands for because I live in a world of acronyms, but in COBRA, it's the National Coalition of Black Reparations Association, something like that. But what they do is advocate for reparations. They first ask for a formal apology, the creation of an African knowledge program, the right to land for social and economic development, funds for a cooperative enterprise, resources for health, wellness, and healing, education for community development and empowerment, affordable housing, strengthening Black communities through communications infrastructure, preserving Black sacred sites and monuments, and repairing the damage of the criminal justice system. Systemic inequity is a complex combination. A lot of people don't pursue justice work because they don't know the right answer, but the truth is there is no right answer. It's a series of responses that we need to incorporate. It's a complex combination of interrelated elements consciously designed to create support and sustain social justice. It reinforces and replicates equitable ideas, power, resources, strategies, conditions. Justice is the systemic fair treatment of people of all races that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes so that everyone can achieve their full potential in life, regardless of race, ethnicity, or the community that they live in, where you live, work, and play. When thinking of advocacy, I wanted to take an opportunity to be transparent with you that advocacy, the purpose of advocacy is to support policy. It's informing, emphasizing the voices of the underrepresented, researching, writing, supporting other advocacy organizations, but it puts the power with the policymakers seeking the solutions, and it puts the attention on policymakers, those in power. When paired with the empowerment method, however, it focuses on the achievement of goals, the changing of systems. It strengthens the resilience in communities by focusing on competence rather than the deficits in individual social functions. It removes barriers by using this language, not for us, without us, connecting communities that are oppressed to seats at the table. And then there's activism, where you're not necessarily connecting community level trends noted or challenges to political opportunity like advocacy, but instead you're recognizing that this solution may not exist, and I'm going to go out and march and do die-in protesting and raise my voice so that they create this opportunity that does not exist. And that's really what activism is about. Examples of that is hunger strike, protesting. You can also use researching and fundraising to sustain efforts. So I encourage all of you all to be a part of the solution. And this is a quote that I put from the same march in Washington that happened in 1963 actually occurred in August, on August 28th as well. So I want to challenge each of you to accept the torch, especially as we approach MLK Day of Dr. King, handed to all Americans back in 1963 during that I Have a Dream speech. To be the solution, whether it is reaching out to your public officials in allyship, especially with GA session. Today's the first day of the General Assembly session, being here. Whether it's through your rewriting of history and academia, whether it is through public good and servitude, what I want to remind you is that we all have a role to play when it comes to justice. And you have to ask yourself what the right role is for you, because it's not all of them. You do have some opportunities to immediately act. We have a Dr. King Day of Action, January 18th. You can go to that link, brownva.org. I'll type it in the chat. King_day. And what you'll have this day is an opportunity to speak to public officials. The meeting's already lined up with legislators. The governor and his administration are expected to be present. And you see the organizations represented. So there's likely something that you would be interested in or that may speak to your passion. They'll talk about criminal justice, juvenile justice, etc. I also encourage you to pursue a journey of truth and reconciliation. January 18th is Truth and Reconciliation Day, also on MLK Day, where we're partnering with the educational entities, Library of Virginia, VMFA, the Valentine, American Civil War Museum, Initiatives of Change. And ultimately we'll end with an opportunity for you to pursue your own journey of truth and reconciliation. We'll also have some art activists that will be touching on themes of that, racial trauma and diversity and inclusion in a virtual showcase. So all virtual and on Facebook Live at Racial Truth. You can participate in the campaign Digital Advocacy Day. We'll be taking on some huge policy priorities, including racism as a public health crisis, as well as some economic priorities where one, if we were to be successful, and we'd be in the first in the country to have a prescription RX program for folks who face food insecurity, where they would get a prescription to go to a local market to access healthy foods. Here's other upcoming events and the dates of it. You can always go to vakids.org/joinusevents. And then I have some resources for you that you may be interested in. We'll also have our next Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week, August 2nd to August 8th. So stay tuned for that and keep that in mind next August.
Excuse me, Chloe, we have a question about whether or not you need to register for the event on the 18th.
Yes, you do need to register. If you click, if you go to this link, it's kind of a one-stop shop with all of the resources that I'm referencing. Go to events and you'll have the links to all of our upcoming Racial Truth branded events. And I encourage you all to read those equity impact statements that will be under the data tab. Here's my contact information. You can follow us at Racial Truth on all social media as well. We're the same on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I also encourage you to participate in the digital advocacy and sign up to advocate by using our advocacy volunteer form.
We had another question. Will the slides be made available after the talk? And that's, I guess, in addition to the recorded portion of it. Is there some place we can go to get the actual slides that you used?
I can do a PDF of the slides and send them to you, Andrew, to send out to those registered.
Okay. Anyone who is interested in getting those can contact me at my email address, asmith@wrl.org.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for participating in today's event. I encourage you all to get involved in action this GA session, and my contact information is here if you have any questions or if you would like me at any other speaking engagements on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe.
Chloe.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.